In all the conversations we have about domestic violence, what's rarely discussed is the role of religion. We talk about women in Islam, but statistically it's evangelical Christian men who attend church sporadically who are the most likely to assault their wives. Male leadership is a dominant teaching of thousands of congregations, with women taught to submit to their husbands. In a year-long investigation, 730 has spoken with dozens of survivors, church psychologists and clergy about their growing concerns that not enough is being done to stop the abuse of Christian women. Julia Baird and Paige McKenzie have this report.
We met at university and he was quite a charming man, just a young fellow, but he was really, really dead keen on me, and I suppose I was quite flattered by that. I thought I was in love, he was in love, and we were going to make a good future together.
He used biblical context of obedience frequently, and the most frequent one, of course, is you promise to obey. His view was that he was the male, the husband, and the head of the household, and therefore I should obey him, and by not obeying him I was being disobedient to God.
The church calls it male headship, that a woman must submit to her husband as set out in the scriptures. It's been taught to congregations for centuries, but increasingly women in the church are saying enough. That headship is more about control than biblical truth, and is even used as a licence for violence.
I believe the doctrine of headship is actually vital to the notion of domestic abuse in the church, because it gives a quasi-scriptural theological justification for a man to have full authority over a woman. And once you have that position, then it doesn't take very long before you are in fact justifying that woman being beaten by her husband.
The church has created an abuser-friendly environment. If you stand up to a man, you're trying to usurp his authority, and it's sinful. When you're actually entrapped...
Barbara Roberts was in an abusive evangelical marriage for many years. Finally, she left and is now demanding the church listen to women struggling against domestic violence.
It's common in what you would probably call the conservative stream of the church. Presbyterians, Sydney Anglicans, quite a few of the Baptists, and quite a lot of the Pentecostal churches.
In Australia, there's never been any real research into the prevalence of domestic violence within church communities. But Barbara runs a website for survivors, which points to an alarming trend. She estimates 800,000 Christian women who've survived abuse around the world have visited the page.
Christian women are particularly vulnerable because they take the Bible very seriously and they want to obey God. They know it says, turn the other cheek. They know it says, be long-suffering.
If violence is created, then I would question whether this is of God at all.
Reverend Andrew Semple has seen multiple cases of domestic violence within his own Anglican ministry.
In my ministry within Parish Life 5 that come to mind, we're caught up in this idea of male headship and the man having to rule over the woman. I could see bruising, and that said to me there's something wrong here.
What would you like to say to a man in one of the congregations in this area who is abusive towards his wife?
I would say, be the man of God that God has called you to be, and do not lay a hand upon her. If there are people who claim that they're following the Bible's teaching and are abusing their wives, they have clearly not understood the Bible's teaching.
If this is the message of the leadership of the church, then clearly it's not getting through to a number of congregations. Men are continuing to use or misuse the teachings of the Bible to justify the abuse of their wives. Louise attended a Pentecostal church in Brisbane. After they got married, her husband's behaviour changed.
I remember having a watch thrown at me, spice bottles thrown at me. I'd get pinned up against the wall and yelled at for hours and restrained and not allowed to go to the toilet. He'd be yelling at me while I was breastfeeding. One of the things that he did from early on was actually wake me up in the middle of the night. I'd be woken up by being yelled at.
In South Australia, Tabitha experienced the same controlling behaviour at the hands of her Anglican husband.
Certainly everything that I did was subject to his approval, including, you know, what I watched on television, what I read, what I ate, what I drank, who I saw, how long I saw them for. Could I use the phone? Could I ring my parents? What did you tell them?
Disturbingly, Tabitha's abusive husband was a priest.
I spoke to 2 bishops, neither of which, again, believed me. It was one sent me off for, the first one sent me off for psychological counselling, but they didn't send him off. They just didn't want to believe that it was happening or wouldn't acknowledge that it was happening. All they've done is just sent him off to another parish where he's happily practising still.
We know of numbers of cases where the abuser is a pastor or a minister in the church. How hard is it for that pastor's wife to disclose? She knows she's not going to be believed. She knows he's already got a great big boys' club of allies.
For Louise, the abuse drove her to despair.
Oh, look, I really was plagued with thoughts of suicide, and one time I went to the local train station and my daughter ran after me and I thought, oh no, my children, I can't leave them to him. I just can't. I thought, well, he's either going to kill me or I'll just take it into my hands to kill myself. I did approach my pastors anyway. They didn't believe me.
Here in Sydney, we're hearing this, that you should just knuckle under and suffer the consequences. I mean, it's an appalling argument to say that people should live with abuse.
How long have you been a priest for?
Nearly 36 years.
But you have never preached one sermon just on domestic violence.
I haven't preached one sermon on domestic violence. What I have preached is on relationships between husbands and wives where distortion of headship is to be eschewed and not allowed.
But Barbara Roberts believes church authorities are ignoring the full scale of the problem and that the abuse can extend to rape in marriage.
I think marital rape is common with all domestic abuse where the man is abusing the woman. It's one of the most untold stories.
I often think about whether it was rape or not, because in a way it was easier for me to consent because I was safer that way. So you give in and sort of, you know, close your eyes and hope for the best.
In many quarters of the church, females aren't allowed to preach or take on significant leadership roles. There are concerns that as long as women's voices are denied within the church, domestic violence will continue.
It's very dangerous if women aren't seen to be in leadership roles, because that just confirms and permits the sort of submission teaching that's going on.
So the fact that there are different places for women to exercise ministry in our church does not affect the equality of women and men in ministry.
You're saying that they're equal, but men can be priests and women cannot.
Well, how do you explain that men and women are equal, but only women can have babies?
That's a biological difference.
Yes, it is a biological difference. because the biological difference between males and females affects everything they do.
So because women can have babies, they shouldn't be priests?
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying there's a difference between males and females. I've given you an example of a difference which doesn't affect equality.
Survivors of abuse say entrenched views about the role of women mean the church is blind to their plight.
They need to open their eyes and they need to recognise that it is happening, and it is happening that the people in the pews, the people standing at the pulpit, and they need to stop pretending that it's a secular problem.
For these women, it's a long road to healing.
Psychologically, I'm just crippled with anxiety and fear still. Some days I have gotten ready to go to a church. I've just sat down on my bed again and thought, no, I can't face this, you know. Somewhere along the way I died, you know, I've been trying to piece myself back together. And somewhere along there, I don't know where I went, you know. Some good things have come out of it, that my younger children didn't have to, you know, grow up in that environment as well, so I thank God at least, you know. It's just us, and, you know, we're so peaceful. We're a very peaceful family. We have lots of laughs, and we're so loving.
If that story's raised concerns for you or a loved one, please call the National Domestic Violence Counselling Service on 1800 RESPECT. That's 1800 737 732. It's a tough task for anyone to put pen to paper and tell the story of their life, but imagine if you were related to one of the most famous authors of all time. This week marks 200 years since legendary writer Jane Austen died. And while fans mark the occasion, many may not realise she has an Australian connection. Caroline Jane Knight is Jane Austen's fifth great niece. She was the last relative to grow up on the estate where Austen lived and wrote. She spoke to Lauren Day about her new book and growing up in the shadow of the author's legacy.
To me as a child, it was normal, it's all I knew. Jane Austen was ever present. Jane Austen's cottage where she lived, which was on the grounds of the estate, is just 400 metres from the front door of the great house where I grew up.
For Caroline Knight, the legacy of Jane Austen's bloodline is more than just DNA.
I think growing up in 400 years of your own history, which I did, is a very unique experience and a real privilege. I mean, I know, you know, the 15 generations that had come before me in Chawton. It was built in 1588, the house, by John Knight. And it gave me an incredible sense of who I am and where I come from, and belonging to something, you know, belonging to something that, as I said, had been going on for generations.
Caroline Knight's fourth great-grandfather, Edward Austen Knight, was Jane Austen's brother. And Caroline, like the young author, spent her formative years in the family's ancestral estate.
Did you have a sense at all that you were living in Jane Austen's shadow?
When I was a child, my grandmother ran a tea room from the great hall at the front of our house, you know, the big room at the front. So I earned my pocket money as a child, serving tea to Jane Austen devotees, and occasionally being hugged by overwhelmed fans and things like that. But it meant that she was always talked about, always there, and people were, you know, constantly quoting her work. And I think, although I wouldn't have thought about it as being in her shadow, it's certainly, having Jane Austen as a role model was phenomenal. I mean, I grew up, you know, with a woman who, despite everything that was against her at the time, set out with a goal and achieved it. And that's certainly something that I've taken on.
You were forced to leave behind Chawton at 17. Can you tell me a bit about that?
So my grandfather, who inherited in 1932, inherited an estate that was already in dire financial difficulties. And when my grandfather actually died in 1987, when I was 17, that was just the end. I mean, it just wasn't possible. The place already was in desperate need of restoration. All the money had run out. Every outbuilding had been sold. Every valuable possession of the family pretty much had been sold. So it was inevitable. We knew it was going to happen, but obviously after that amount of time, it didn't make it any easier for it to all come to an end. I left absolutely determined that I was going to make my own way in the world, that I was going to, be financially independent and successful, and I didn't want the legacy of Jane Austen to have any effect negatively or positively on that. I wanted to make it on my own.
Years later, after moving to her mother's country of birth, Australia, for business, Caroline Knight had a chance meeting with the director of the hit BBC Pride and Prejudice series, which, with the help of Colin Firth, had created a new wave of Austen fans.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Bennett?
The producer encouraged her to finally write the story of how she came to embrace her Austen heritage.
It took probably 6 months for me to even, I say, pick up a pen, start at the laptop. And because, the first thing is, exactly, when the writing bar has been set so high in the family, it's terrifying thinking, if I write anything, will people start making comparisons? Will that start to overshadow actually the story, I suppose, I'm trying to tell? But I, eventually decided not to worry about that. And it's not a novel anyway, so it's not as though that direct comparison, is there.
Jane Austen only wrote 6 novels before she died at 41, but they spurred thousands of adaptations.
It's not the mother you have to dance with, Darcy, it's the daughter. She's charming.
No, she looks tolerable enough. But I'm in no humour tonight to give consequence to the middle classes at play.
Jane Austen's plots obviously highlight women's traditional dependence on marriage for their social standing and economic security. How relevant are those plots today?
I think it very much actually depends on where in the world you're talking about. There are cultures in which that situation is still very much relevant, where women still don't have the opportunity to have jobs and own their own property and that sort of thing. She's loved all over the world, but in different ways, because some women today can still absolutely relate directly to what the women in Jane Austen's novels were experiencing. But I think everybody can relate to the joy of finding love.
Why do you think her work continues to resonate so strongly around the world?
I think, at its basis, obviously, because it's just an absolute masterpiece. She is such a good writer. She paints such great portraits of people, often in just a few very, very carefully chosen words. And I think at the heart of it, what it actually shows is while environments may change, while the political situations may change, while all of that may change, actually people are people, whatever century you're talking about. And I think because that's where she really focuses her energy, is actually into the human interactions. Those have stood the test of time very well.
That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.